A 15-year-old boy is standing outside a shop window on a high street in Sutton, South London, England, on a Saturday afternoon in September. It's 1988. He's got a bit of cash in his pocket, a mild obsession with football, and absolutely nowhere he's supposed to be for the rest of the day. His friend has just said goodbye to him and turned to walk home. The boy, Lee, stays behind for a few more minutes, maybe to look at a shop, maybe to decide what to do next. That is the last confirmed moment any person has admitted to seeing Lee Boxell alive. No struggle, no scream, no blood, no witness who says they saw anything happen to him. He was there, and then, at some point between that afternoon and the rest of history, he simply was not anywhere at all. Not at home, not at a hospital, not on a train, not at the football match he may or may not have said he was going to. Not anywhere the Metropolitan Police, one of the largest and most resourced police forces on the planet, has been able to find in 37 years of looking. His parents are still alive. They are in their late 70s and 80s now. They have never moved house, because what if he calls and the numbers changed? And somewhere in the borough of Sutton, in a quiet churchyard behind a red brick Anglican church, is a patch of ground that police once tore open with the largest archaeological excavation in the history of London's Metropolitan Police. Searching not for evidence, not for a weapon, but for a body. Lee's body. They didn't find him there either. This is the story of Lee Boxell, a case that started as a missing persons file, quietly became a suspected murder investigation, and has never, not once, produced a single solid answer. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why detectives believe they know why Lee disappeared, and why, even knowing that, they still can't tell his parents where their son is. Before we get into the how and the why, we need to slow down and actually meet him, because it's easy, 37 years on, for Lee Boxell to become a case number, a Wikipedia stub, a thumbnail. He wasn't any of those things. He was a kid. Lee Darren Boxell was born on the 16th of February 1973 in Surrey, England. His parents, Peter and Christine Boxell, raised him first in Cheam, a leafy, quiet, thoroughly unremarkable suburb inside the London borough of Sutton, the kind of place where nothing ever happens, which is exactly why what happened to Lee felt so impossible to the people who knew him. For a stretch of his childhood, the family actually lived abroad. Peter worked as an architectural engineer, and his job took the family to Hanover, Germany, where he helped design housing on military bases. Lee spent part of his early life there, before the Boxells moved back to the UK in 1984, settling again in Cheam. 2 years after Lee was born, his sister Lindsay arrived, and by every account that survives from that household, the Boxells were an ordinary, close, unremarkable family. Not wealthy, not troubled, not fractured, just a mum, a dad, 2 kids, and a semi-detached house in the suburbs. By 1988, Lee was 15. He was a schoolboy, and by all accounts a good one, never in trouble, described by his father as kind and considerate, someone who got along fine with his family, and hadn't given anyone a single reason to worry about him. He was, by his father's own description years later, shy, a bit socially awkward, the kind of teenager who wasn't the loudest personality in the room. But, and this detail becomes important much later in this story, those who knew him also described him as having a strong, stubborn character underneath that shyness. If Lee believed something was wrong, he wasn't the type to just look away. He loved football, genuinely, obsessively, the way a lot of 15-year-old English boys in the late 80s loved football, before the Premier League, before sky-high ticket prices, when going to watch your local club on a Saturday afternoon was just what you did. Lee's team allegiances and habits would end up mattering a great deal to investigators later, because on the day he vanished, the working theory, for years, was that a football match was exactly where he was headed. There is nothing in Lee's background, no argument, no note, no history of running away, no signs of depression or crisis, that gives any indication he left home that Saturday morning, intending not to come back. That absence of a motive to disappear voluntarily is, in cold case investigation, one of the loudest signals there is. When someone with no reason to run simply doesn't come home, Everyone who has ever worked a missing persons case knows what that usually means. And yet, in 1988, the people whose job it was to investigate that signal almost let it slip past them entirely. We'll get to that. First, let's walk through exactly what happened on the day Lee disappeared, because the timeline of September 10, 1988, has been picked apart, argued over, and re-examined for nearly 4 decades, and every single hour of it still matters. It's a Saturday morning. Lee is at home in Cheam. According to family accounts, his parents had seen him that morning half asleep in the living room armchair before he headed out. An image that, looking back, is almost unbearably ordinary. A teenage boy, barely awake, slouched in a chair on a weekend morning. His parents assumed, as far as anyone can tell, that he was heading out for a fairly typical day, plans with a friend, maybe a football match later. Nobody in that house had any reason to treat that Saturday morning differently than any other. At around 11 a.m., Lee meets a friend in Sutton town center, the main shopping and commercial hub a short journey from Cheam. The two boys do what teenagers with nowhere in particular to be do on a Saturday. They window shop. They walk up and down the high street, looking in shops, killing time, talking about whatever 15-year-olds talk about. There's no indication of tension, no argument, nothing unusual about the morning at all. At 1:00 p.m., the two friends part ways. Lee's friend heads home. Lee does not. At around 1:30 p.m., Lee is seen. This sighting is corroborated. Standing outside a branch of the Abbey National, a British building society, on Sutton High Street. He's alone at this point. Whatever he's doing it by himself. Then, at roughly 2:20 to 2:30 p.m., Lee is seen one final time, outside a Tesco supermarket on Sutton High Street, just a short walk from Sutton railway station. This is the last confirmed sighting of Lee Boxell that has ever been verified. Not a blurry photograph, not a maybe. A witnessed, corroborated sighting on a public high street, in broad daylight, on a Saturday afternoon, with shoppers all around him. And then, nothing. No further sighting has ever been confirmed. Not that evening. Not the next day. Not in the weeks, months, or decades since. A 15-year-old boy, last seen in broad daylight, on a busy commercial street in one of London's outer boroughs, effectively evaporates. Do the math on that timeline for a second, because it matters. From 1:00 p.m., when his friend left him, to 2:20 or 2:30 p.m., when he was last seen, that's roughly 90 minutes unaccounted for. 90 minutes in which Lee, according to the geography of Sutton, would have had time to walk a fairly short distance, browse a few more shops, maybe make a phone call from a payphone, maybe meet someone. 90 minutes that investigators have spent the better part of 4 decades trying to reconstruct, and that, as you're about to hear, became the single most important gap in the entire case. Sutton railway station sits just a few minutes' walk from where Lee was last seen. It's the kind of detail that sounds small, until you realize what it means. From that spot, Lee could have gone almost anywhere in London within the hour. A train to Victoria, a train to Croydon, a bus in any direction. He was, geographically, one decision away from vanishing into the largest city in Western Europe, and that is functionally what happened, whether he made that choice himself or someone made it for him. His parents expected him home that evening. He didn't come. They weren't panicked immediately. Most parents of teenage boys have had at least one evening where the kid rolls in late. But as the hours stretched past a reasonable bedtime, and then past midnight, that ordinary parental irritation curdled into something else. By the next morning, Lee Boxell had not come home, had not called, had not been seen by a single other person his family could locate. Peter and Christine Boxell did what any parent would do next. They called the police. And this is where the story takes its first, and in many ways most damaging, turn. Here is something that modern true crime audiences, raised on procedural dramas where every missing child triggers an immediate Amber Alert and a task force, need to understand about 1988. A missing 15-year-old boy did not automatically mean urgency. When Peter and Christine Boxell reported Lee missing, the response they got from the Metropolitan Police was, by multiple later accounts, treated initially as a fairly standard missing persons case. the kind police saw constantly involving teenage boys. Officers reportedly suggested to the family, at least in the early going, that Lee would likely turn up, that this was the sort of thing that happened with teenagers. They push a boundary, they go off with mates, they turn up sheepish, a day or two later wanting to know why everyone's so upset. It's not an unreasonable statistical assumption. The overwhelming majority of missing teenagers in Britain, then and now, are exactly that, temporary. A fight with a parent, a crush gone sideways, a desire to prove independence for 48 hours before hunger and boredom send them home. If you're a detective looking at hundreds of these cases a year, the base rate tells you, wait, don't panic, he'll come back. But here's the problem, and it's the same problem that shows up again and again across true crime cases involving teenagers who never come home. Base rates are not the same as an individual case. Lee Boxell did not fit the profile of a runaway. He had no history of running. He had no documented conflict at home. He hadn't packed a bag, taken extra clothes, or emptied a savings account. He'd walked out that Saturday morning expecting, by every indication, to come home that night, just like he had every other Saturday of his life. His parents knew this immediately. They knew their son, and in that first agonizing week, while police treated the case with the standard caution reserved for teenage runaways, Peter and Christine Boxell were watching their world quietly come apart, trying to convince investigators that this specific case was different. It's worth pausing here to say something plainly, because this pattern recurs so often in cold cases that it deserves to be named directly. The first 48 to 72 hours of a missing person investigation are, by wide consensus among investigators, the most critical window there is. Evidence is freshest. Memories are sharpest. CCTV, where it exists, hasn't been overwritten yet. Witnesses haven't yet convinced themselves that what they saw wasn't important. Every hour that a case is treated as low priority in that window is an hour that potential evidence has to survive on its own, unprotected, uncollected. 1988, it's worth remembering, was also a very different technological era. CCTV coverage across London was a fraction of what exists today. Nothing like the dense camera network that would later catch, say, a teenager stepping off a train at King's Cross. Sutton High Street in 1988 did not offer investigators a digital trail to follow. There was no phone to ping, no bank card to trace, no social media footprint to reconstruct his final hours from. Whatever evidence existed had to be gathered from human memory, human witnesses, and human willingness to come forward. And that is a far more fragile kind of evidence than a hard drive. Eventually, as days turned into weeks and Lee did not reappear, the tenor of the investigation shifted. This was not a runaway. This was something else. But by the time that shift happened, the most valuable window in the entire case had already closed. It's the kind of institutional failure that, viewed with the benefit of hindsight, seems almost unforgivable. And it's one that police themselves would later, quietly, acknowledge. Decades on, a senior investigator reviewing the case from scratch would go so far as to say, the file should have been treated as a murder inquiry from day one. But in September 1988, nobody was saying that yet. What they were doing, instead, was launching a public appeal, the biggest tool available to them at the time. By December of 1988, 3 months after Lee vanished, the Metropolitan Police had escalated the case to national television. Lee's disappearance was featured on BBC's Crime Watch, the flagship British program, where unsolved crimes were presented to millions of viewers, with reconstructions and direct appeals for information. For a case like this, in that era, Crime Watch wasn't just a segment. It was close to the ceiling of what police could do to reach the public. The appeal generated calls, more than a dozen, according to reports from the time. People phoned in with tips, sightings, theories, half-memories of a boy who might have matched Lee's description somewhere in London that autumn. And here is the frustrating, familiar shape this case takes again and again. None of it led anywhere. No confirmed sighting. No solid lead that police could chase to a conclusion. The calls were logged, followed up where possible, and the trail, such as it was, went cold again. It's worth understanding just how much weight a program like Crime Watch carried in Britain at the time. This wasn't a niche cable segment. This was appointment viewing, watched by a meaningful fraction of the entire country, with a track record of actually cracking cases through tips from ordinary viewers. If Lee Boxell was somewhere within reach of British television, a runaway hiding in a bedsit somewhere, living under a different name, or even a victim being held or concealed by someone local, the odds that someone watching that broadcast knew something should have been reasonably high. And yet nothing surfaced. No sighting from a landlord who recognized a lodger. No tip from a relative who noticed a nephew acting strangely. No confirmation. No denial. Nothing solid enough to move the investigation forward. For a family already living through the worst months of their lives, watching a national appeal generate noise but no signal must have been its own particular kind of agony. Hope offered, and then quietly withdrawn, over and over. The Boxells would return to Crime Watch again in later years, most notably on what would have been Lee's 40th birthday, 25 years after he disappeared, still appealing, still hoping the right person watching television that night would finally decide to come forward. We'll get to that broadcast, because by then the entire shape of the investigation had changed. But in 1988, all the family had was a plea broadcast into the dark, and the agonizing wait to see if anyone would answer it. With the initial appeal producing no breakthrough, investigators fell back on the one concrete physical clue that existed in the case, something Lee had reportedly said to his friend that morning, before they parted ways. And for years, that single detail would come to dominate the entire theory of what happened to him. Here's the detail that shaped the public understanding of this case for years. Lee had reportedly mentioned to his friend, at some point that morning, the possibility of going to watch a football match that afternoon at Selhurst Park, the South London stadium that, in that era, was shared by two clubs, Crystal Palace and Charlton Athletic. On the 10th of September 1988, Charlton Athletic were playing Millwall at that ground. For years, this single offhand comment became the leading theory in the case. The story that circulated, the one that made a certain intuitive sense to a family and a public, desperate for an explanation, was simple. Lee went to the match. Something happened to him there, or on the way there, or on the way back. Case theories built entire investigative threads around Selhurst Park, around football violence, a very real and very dangerous phenomenon in English football during that era, around the idea that a 15-year-old boy, wandering toward a football ground alone, might have crossed paths with the wrong group of people at exactly the wrong moment. But there's a problem with this theory, and it's a problem of simple arithmetic. Kickoff for that match was at 3:00 p.m. Lee was last confirmed seen outside a Tesco on Sutton High Street at somewhere between 2:20 and 2:30 p.m. Investigators who later mapped the travel time from that specific spot on Sutton High Street to Selhurst Park concluded that it would not have been physically possible for Lee to make that journey and arrive in time for kickoff. The geography simply doesn't support the theory that dominated public understanding of this case for a generation. Police have been explicit about this in later statements. There is no evidence that Lee actually attended or was even traveling toward that match. It may have been nothing more than a passing comment from a 15-year-old boy thinking out loud about his Saturday. The kind of thing teenagers say without any real commitment behind it. A maybe, a we'll see. A comment that got remembered and repeated by his friend, and then calcified over years into something that sounded a lot more like a confirmed plan than it ever actually was. This matters for a reason that goes beyond just correcting the historical record. For years, resources, theories, and public attention were oriented around Selhurst Park, around football violence, around a stadium crowd, around an event that, by the numbers, Lee almost certainly never reached. It's a sobering illustration of how a single loose thread, one remembered sentence from a 15-year-old, filtered through grief and repetition and speculation, can end up steering an entire investigation's public narrative for decades, even when the underlying math never supported it. So if Lee wasn't heading to a football match, what was he doing in that unaccounted-for window between 1 o'clock and roughly 2:30 p.m.? And where did he go after that final sighting outside Tesco? For a very long time, nobody had an answer. What they had, instead, was a family, living, breathing, aging, trapped inside a question mark that refused to close. We need to talk, for a moment, about what happens to a family when a child disappears and simply never comes back. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, daily, grinding reality of it. Peter and Christine Boxell did not move house, not in the immediate aftermath, and not in the decades that followed. They stayed in Cheam, the same area, the same postcode, the same proximity to the last place their son was ever confirmed to have stood. By multiple accounts, they kept Lee's bedroom, essentially as it was the last time they saw him, not as a shrine exactly, but preserved, untouched, waiting. A door that could be opened onto a version of 1988 that the rest of the world had long since moved past. Think about what that actually means, practically, for 37 years. It means every single day, walking down a hallway in your own home, past a door that represents the single worst unanswered question a parent can carry. It means birthdays that never got celebrated, only marked. It means a sister, Lindsay, 2 years younger than Lee, growing up and then growing older, in a household permanently organized around an absence. In 1998, on the 10th anniversary, Christine Boxell spoke publicly about what that not knowing actually felt like day to day. She described it, in the plainest possible terms, as a nightmare. Made worse, she said, by the arrival of cold weather each year, because it made her wonder whether her son, if he was somehow still alive, was cold, was sleeping rough, was suffering somewhere she couldn't reach him. It's an almost unbearably specific kind of anguish. Not just is my son alive, but is my son cold right now, tonight, somewhere I can't picture. By 2018, 30 years on, Peter Boxell, then in his early 70s, gave an interview that captured the particular cruelty of this kind of case better than almost anything else on record. He described living in limbo for 3 decades, not knowing whether his son was alive, safe, and simply gone by choice, or whether he had been murdered. He said, plainly, that he was getting older and did not want his life to end without ever discovering the truth. That's the part of these cases that rarely makes it into the procedural details, the timelines, the theories, but it's the part that actually defines them. A missing persons case isn't just an open file sitting in a records room. It's a specific set of parents who cannot bury their son, cannot hold a funeral, cannot access whatever fragile piece comes with grief, because grief requires knowing what you're grieving. Peter and Christine Boxell have spent 37 years unable to even begin that process, trapped in a permanent, unresolved present tense, waiting for a phone call that would either bring their son home or, at the very least, tell them where to find him. For more than 2 decades after Lee vanished, that's genuinely all there was. A cold case, a grieving family, a file gathering dust in a records room, periodically dusted off for an anniversary appeal that generated headlines and sympathy but no answers. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Not because of anything to do with Lee directly, but because of an entirely separate criminal case that, almost by accident, cracked open a door that had been sealed for 23 years. In 2011, a man named William Lambert was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He was 75 years old at the time of sentencing. Lambert had worked as the graveyard digger at St. Dunstan's Church in Cheam, the same quiet suburb where Lee Boxell grew up, less than a mile from the spot where he was last seen. Lambert was convicted of sexually abusing 4 girls who had attended a youth club he ran out of the church grounds. That youth club was not an officially sanctioned institution. It wasn't run through the church leadership, wasn't overseen by any formal safeguarding body. This was the late 1980s, decades before the UK's modern child protection frameworks existed. It operated out of an outbuilding on the church property, an annex, essentially a shed, and it was known, locally, by exactly that name, the Shed. For years, teenagers in the Cheam area had used the Shed as a hangout, a place to smoke, to drink, to socialize away from adult supervision, the kind of unofficial, semi-secret teenage gathering spot that existed in countless British suburbs during that era, invisible to parents, invisible to police, sustained entirely by word of mouth between kids. And because it operated entirely outside any formal structure, it also became, investigators would later determine, a hunting ground, a place where a predator with access to the space and reason to be trusted around children could operate for years, essentially unsupervised, unquestioned, because he was the church groundskeeper and nobody thought to look any closer. When Lambert's conviction became public in 2011, it did something almost nobody expected. It reopened the Lee Boxell case. Detective Inspector John McQuaid, reviewing the file that year, began developing an entirely new theory, one that police had never previously connected to Lee's disappearance at all. Witnesses came forward, for the first time in over 2 decades, with a piece of information nobody had shared with investigators back in 1988. Lee Boxell used to go to the shed. Think about the timeline for a second, because it's genuinely staggering. For 23 years, nearly a quarter of a century, police investigating Lee's disappearance had no idea that this youth club existed, no idea that Lee had any connection to it, and therefore, no idea that it might be relevant. It took a completely unrelated criminal prosecution of a different set of victims, entirely by coincidence, to surface the one piece of context that would finally reframe the entire case. The theory investigators began building from 2011 onward was this. On the afternoon of September 10, 1988, during that unaccounted-for window after 1:00 p.m., Lee may have gone to the shed to meet friends, exactly the way any teenager might have on a Saturday afternoon. And while there, police came to believe he may have witnessed something. Specifically, they developed the theory that Lee walked in on an act of sexual abuse being committed against another child at the club, and that what happened to him next happened because of what he saw. Detective Inspector McQuaid, speaking publicly about the theory, painted a specific picture of who Lee was in that moment, describing him as shy, a bit socially awkward day-to-day, but underneath that, someone with real inner strength. His stated belief was that if Lee had witnessed abuse happening in front of him, he wouldn't have simply looked away. He would have said something. He would have stood up to it. And that, according to the theory police built, is precisely what may have gotten him killed, not because he was a target of the abuse himself. Investigators have been explicit that there's no indication Lee was a victim of any sexual offense personally, but because he refused to be a bystander to someone else's. McQuaid described Lee, in that scenario, as a victim of circumstance, a phrase that has haunted this case ever since. Not a target, not chosen. Just a 15-year-old boy who happened to walk through the wrong door at the wrong moment and refused to pretend he hadn't seen what he saw. If this theory is correct, and police have never presented it as anything more than their leading working theory, not a proven fact, it means Lee Boxell didn't die because of anything about him. He died, if he died, because he had the kind of character that wouldn't let him ignore a child being hurt in front of him. It's an almost unbearable irony, the exact trait his father always described with pride. That quiet, stubborn decency may be the very thing that cost him his life. And it also means that somewhere out there, then and possibly now, there are people who know exactly what happened inside the shed that Saturday afternoon in 1988. People who were children themselves at the time, who are now in their 50s, who may have carried this secret, deliberately or through simple fear, for nearly 4 decades. Once police developed this theory, they didn't just appeal for witnesses, they went looking for a body, and what they did next became, by their own description, the largest search operation of its kind the Metropolitan Police had ever conducted. In 2012, investigators sealed off part of the churchyard at St. Dunstan's Church in Cheam, the same church where the shed had operated, less than a mile from Sutton High Street, where Lee had last been seen. A forensic team moved in with ground-penetrating radar, systematically scanning beneath the surface for any sign of disturbed earth, buried remains, anything that might explain what had happened to a boy who vanished 24 years earlier. The initial excavation ran through the summer of 2012. Officers described it, carefully, as routine activity tied to the ongoing inquiry, deliberately measured language for what was, in reality, an active search for a murdered child's body on consecrated ground. The dig resumed again in April of 2013, continuing through that year. By the time it concluded, Scotland Yard would describe it as the largest archaeological excavation the Metropolitan Police had ever undertaken. an extraordinary commitment of forensic resources, time, and manpower to a single cold case, 25 years after the fact. To coincide with the search, and with what would have been Lee's 40th birthday, police returned to Crime Watch in 2013 with a new appeal. This time built entirely around the new theory, the shed, the youth club, the witnesses who might still be out there, now adults, now perhaps parents themselves of children the same age Lee was when he disappeared. Detective Inspector McQuaid made a direct, specific appeal to their consciences, telling anyone who had been at the shed that day, anyone who saw what happened to Lee, that it was time to come forward. The appeal generated something the original 1988 broadcast never had: focused, specific responses. Police received an allegation of sexual abuse connected to the case for the first time. Investigators described some of the calls that came in as being very closely aligned with the specific line of inquiry they were already pursuing, described, in their words, as promising. One caller came forward as a victim of an offense from that era who had never previously reported it. For the first time in 25 years, it felt like the case was genuinely moving. By early 2013, officers said publicly that they had closed in on 2 persons of interest. Momentum, after 2.5 decades of near-total silence, seemed to finally be building towards something. And then, the dig ended. After a year of forensic excavation across the churchyard, using ground-penetrating radar and painstaking manual work across consecrated ground, the search team found nothing. No remains, no physical trace of Lee Boxell anywhere on that property. The theory that had reopened the entire case, the theory that had generated the most promising leads investigators had seen in a generation, produced a location, a motive, a mechanism, and no body. It's worth sitting with how strange that is. A theory this specific, this internally consistent, corroborated by multiple independent witnesses coming forward decades after the fact. And yet the physical search built directly on top of it turned up nothing at all, which means one of a few things has to be true. Either Lee's remains are somewhere else entirely, moved from wherever this incident may have occurred, or the theory, while directionally correct about what happened to Lee that day, is wrong about where his body ended up, or there's a piece of this story that still hasn't surfaced, even now. Because just 1 year after that excavation came up empty, the case would take yet another turn, one that produced actual arrests, and a piece of testimony so contradictory, so strange, that it remains one of the most unresolved details in the entire file to this day. In April of 2014, police made their move. 4 people were arrested in connection with Lee Boxell's disappearance. 3 men, aged 41, 52, and 78, and 1 woman, aged 42. The arrests covered a serious range of potential offenses: suspicion of murder, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and indecency involving children. This was, by a wide margin, the most significant law enforcement action the case had ever produced. 26 years after Lee vanished, police finally had people in custody, being questioned under caution, in direct connection with what happened to him. And then, all 4 were released without charge. That's the frustrating, familiar shape of so many cold cases: an arrest that generates headlines and hope, followed by a release that generates neither closure nor explanation. Insufficient evidence to charge is not the same as innocence, and it's not the same as guilt either. It exists in a legal gray zone that offers a grieving family almost nothing to hold on to. But something did emerge from that investigative period that deserves its own dedicated telling, because it's genuinely one of the strangest and most chilling details in this entire case. During the course of the investigation, one man, since deceased, reportedly bragged to more than one person that he had buried Lee Boxell in the churchyard at St. Dunstan's Church. Not a vague rumor, not second-hand gossip filtered through 3 sets of retelling. A direct claim, made by a specific individual, that he personally knew where Lee's body was because he had put it there himself. When police eventually located and questioned this man directly about the claim, his story changed completely. He told investigators he hadn't buried Lee at all. Instead, he claimed he had helped Lee get away, helped him disappear voluntarily, to start a new life somewhere else, under an assumed identity. According to police, this man and his associates went further, claiming they had actually seen Lee alive again, roughly a year after he vanished. Sit with that for a moment, because it's an almost impossible contradiction to reconcile. The same individual, at different points, to different audiences, claimed both that he had buried a murdered 15-year-old boy in a churchyard, and that he had personally helped that same boy escape to live a new life elsewhere, alive and well, a year later. Those two stories cannot both be true. They may not be able to both be lies either, but they cannot coexist. It was specifically the burial claim, the anonymous tip from members of the public who had heard this man bragging about it, that led directly to the largest excavation in Metropolitan Police history that we just walked through. Investigators took the claim seriously enough to tear open consecrated ground with forensic teams and radar equipment for over a year, and they found nothing. So which story was closer to the truth? Was the burial claim empty boasting, a disturbed individual inventing a horrifying story for reasons of his own, perhaps to inflate his own menace, perhaps for reasons that will never be understood now that he's dead? Or was the burial real, and simply not where he claimed, meaning police searched the wrong patch of earth entirely? Or, and this is the possibility that has never been fully closed off, however unlikely investigators now consider it, was there ever the smallest kernel of truth to the idea that Lee didn't die that day at all? Police, for their part, have been unambiguous in recent years about which of these they consider most credible. As you're about to hear, the current lead investigator on this case has publicly and directly rejected the idea that Lee ran away and built a new life somewhere. But the fact that this contradiction exists at all, a dead man's two irreconcilable claims, one of which triggered the biggest search operation in the case's history, remains one of the great unresolved threads in the entire Lee Boxell file. And with that man now dead, whatever he actually knew went into the ground with him, unconfirmed, unresolved, permanently out of reach. Which brings us to where this case actually stands today. Nearly 4 decades on, with a reward on the table, aging parents still waiting, and a police force that has never closed the file. In September 2023, the 35th anniversary of Lee's disappearance, the Metropolitan Police issued another renewed public appeal. Detective Chief Inspector Kate Blackburn, the current officer leading the investigation, laid out the state of the case in the plainest terms yet offered publicly. She confirmed that a £20,000 reward, originally offered through the charity Crime Stoppers back in 2014, remains active to this day, payable specifically for information that leads to the recovery of Lee's remains, not information leading to a conviction, not information leading to an arrest, information that leads to finding his body. Because after 35 years, that had become the department's stated primary objective, not necessarily prosecuting whoever was responsible, but simply bringing Lee home to his parents so they can bury him. DCI Blackburn addressed the churchyard dig directly, confirming that it remains, to this day, the largest archaeological excavation the Met has ever undertaken, and confirming again that it found nothing. She renewed the appeal specifically to former attendees of The Shed, the youth club at St. Dunstan's, noting that many of those children are adults now, potentially parents themselves, and that some of them may be sitting on information they've never felt able to share. And she addressed head-on the contradictory claims we just walked through. Blackburn stated plainly that the story pushed by that now-deceased man and his associates, that Lee had run away and started a new life under an assumed name somewhere, was, in her words, not viable. She reinforced what colleagues had been building toward for over a decade, that Lee was a boy with a genuinely happy family life, a good student, someone with no plausible reason to disappear by choice, and no history suggesting he ever would. The runaway theory, as far as the Metropolitan Police is concerned today, is dead. Peter Boxell, now in his late 70s, gave a statement alongside that 2023 appeal that is difficult to read without feeling the full weight of 35 years of unanswered waiting. He said, plainly, that he and his wife feared Lee had been murdered. He said he was still hoping someone would come forward to help them find their son's remains so that he and Christine could finally say goodbye, before, in his own words, it becomes too late for them. Read that again. A father, nearing 80 years old, is not asking for justice in the way most true crime cases frame it. He's not demanding a conviction, a trial, a headline verdict. He is asking, simply, for the physical remains of his son, so that he and his wife can hold a funeral before they themselves die. That is the entire scope of what this family is asking the public for, 37 years on. Not vengeance, a goodbye. The £20,000 reward, notably, is only payable through Crime Stoppers directly, not through the police, specifically so that anyone with information can come forward completely anonymously, without ever having to identify themselves to anyone, without ever having any further contact about the case again. It's a structure designed to remove every possible barrier for a witness who might have spent 37 years too afraid, too ashamed, or too uncertain to speak. As of today, Lee Boxell remains an open, unsolved case. He has never been found. No one has ever been charged. The churchyard at St. Dunstan's has been searched and found empty. The football theory has been ruled out. The runaway theory has been publicly rejected by the lead investigator. What remains is a working theory. Lee, walking into the shed on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, witnessing something he refused to look away from, and paying for that decency with his life, that has never been proven, and a family that has spent nearly 4 decades trapped in the space between hope and grief, unable to fully access either one. So let's lay out where this actually leaves us, because a case this layered deserves a clear-eyed summary rather than speculation dressed up as certainty. Theory 1. Lee witnessed abuse at the shed and was killed to keep him silent. This is the theory the Metropolitan Police itself has publicly built its investigation around since 2011. It's supported by the geography. The shed was less than a mile from where Lee was last seen, well within his unaccounted-for window. It's supported by the character evidence. Everyone who knew Lee described him as someone who wouldn't have looked away from wrongdoing, even as a shy 15-year-old. It's supported by independently corroborated witness accounts, decades apart, placing Lee at that youth club. What it lacks, critically, is a body, physical forensic evidence, or a confirmed name of who specifically may have harmed him. Theory 2. The burial claim was true, but the location was wrong. The man who bragged about burying Lee specifically named St. Dunstan's churchyard, and the search there was exhaustive, using ground-penetrating radar across the largest excavation in Met history. But cemeteries are large, disturbed ground constantly through legitimate burials, and a confession made by someone with every reason to lie or exaggerate is not the same as a reliable map coordinate. It remains possible Lee's remains are on that same property, or nearby, in ground that specific search didn't cover. Theory 3. The he's alive claim holds some truth, however faint. Police have explicitly and directly rejected this. The characterization of Lee as a happy, well-adjusted boy, with zero indicators of wanting to run away, combined with 37 years of complete silence, no birthday call, no deathbed confession to a stranger, no chance sighting anywhere in nearly 4 decades of a hyper-connected world, makes this the least credible of the theories, by a significant margin. But it is the one detail in this case that has never been fully, forensically closed off, if only because the alternative to it is so much harder to bear. Theory 4, and this is really the working synthesis most investigators now seem to hold. Lee died as a direct or indirect result of something at the shed, and his remains have simply never been located, moved, buried elsewhere, or disposed of in a way that 37 years of searching, digging, and appealing has not yet uncovered. What's genuinely remarkable, and genuinely sad, about the Lee Boxell case is how much investigators actually do believe they understand about what happened, without ever being able to prove any single piece of it conclusively. They believe they know roughly where. They believe they know roughly why. They have a strong sense of the kind of environment, predatory, unsupervised, hidden in plain sight in a quiet London suburb, that swallowed him. What they don't have, after nearly 4 decades, is enough to charge a single person or bring a single physical trace of Lee back to his family. And that gap, between a confident theory and a provable fact, is where Peter and Christine Boxell have lived for 37 years. Somewhere in Sutton, South London, there is a bedroom that has been kept, in some form, exactly as it was on the morning of September 10th, 1988. There is a mother and father in their 70s and 80s who have spent nearly 4 decades unable to bury their son because nobody has been able to tell them where he is. There is a sister who grew up, and grew old, in the shadow of a door that never got to close properly. And there is, almost certainly, still someone out there, now in their 50s, maybe with children and grandchildren of their own, who was at the shed on that Saturday afternoon in 1988, and who has carried a piece of this story in silence for 37 years. Lee Boxell was 15 years old. He liked football. He was quiet, a little awkward, and by every single account anyone who knew him has ever given, he was fundamentally, stubbornly decent. The kind of person who couldn't just watch someone else get hurt and walk away. If the leading theory in this case is right, that decency is exactly what may have cost him his life, and if that's true, it deserves to be remembered as something closer to bravery than tragedy, even though, for his parents, it will always, unbearably, be both. There is a £20,000 reward, payable anonymously through Crime Stoppers, for anyone who can help bring Lee home. If you know anything, if you ever heard anything, even secondhand, even something that seemed unimportant at the time, that reward, and more importantly, one elderly couple's chance to finally say goodbye to their son, may be one phone call away. Now I want to hear from you. Of the 4 theories we just laid out, which one do you believe actually happened to Lee that afternoon in Sutton? Do you think the answer really is buried somewhere in that churchyard, just outside where police already searched? Drop your theory in the comments below, and if you have any connection to Sutton, Cheam, or St. Dunstan's Church in that era, we would genuinely love to hear what you remember about that neighborhood, because cases like this have been cracked before by exactly the kind of small detail an ordinary viewer remembers and a police file never captured. This channel, AMC True Crime, exists to give cases like Lee Boxell's the attention they deserve, not the loud, headline-grabbing cases that get covered everywhere else, but the quiet, decades-long disappearances that families are still fighting, right now, to keep from being forgotten. If this is the kind of case you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the moment there is any new development in Lee's case, any arrest, any discovery, any answer after 37 years, you will be the first to know. Rest if you can. Wherever you are, Lee, somebody is still looking for you.